Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum to anyone who may be tuning in to this short video, and hello as well to anyone who may be tuning in. So I wanted to continue with another video in the series of embarking on your spiritual path. And in the previous few videos I've just been reflecting upon what happens when you want to embark on a spiritual path within the Islamic tradition. So first of all, I was talking about how when you go online and you look up how to embark on your spiritual path, you see very little talking from within the Islamic tradition. So in the West, people's main idea of tapping into some kind of spirituality is to turn to practices or ideas that have been extracted from Sanatana Dharma, as an example, which is fine. But like I say, there's a kind of automatic assumption that if you want to be spiritual in the very secularized Western world, if you want to be spiritual, then you borrow a meditation practice, or you borrow the idea of chakras, or you borrow the idea of burning certain types of incense from here and there, and it's kind of it's utilized in such a way as to, I suppose, be adapted to a very secularized environment. One of the reasons why I came to Islam, or I accepted Islam, was that I recognized that just borrowing different bits and pieces from different ways, we could call it, doesn't really fundamentally change the foundations of the way you live. So what happens in a secularized West is that we are still fundamentally living within a secularized, capitalist, corporatized structure. Of course, I mean, there may be movements to counter that, planting trees and, eco movements and going vegan and so on. But again, it's not part of a holistic teaching. Another thing is that Islam has a very classical approach to morality. As we know, for the last 100 years in the Western world, particularly since the 1920s, there's been a kind of a desire to smash the formation of the family, to kind of break down what looks like restrictions on people's sexuality, and the big message has been pumped out to populations that if you want to be free, part of that freedom is expressing your sexuality and being almost like primarily a sexual being. And as I've argued before, particularly women in the Western world, they're either sexual beings or economic beings. They're not spiritual beings. Whereas I consider that first and foremost we are spiritual beings. And this whole message that to be free you have to kind of take off your clothes and express your sexuality, I just really see that as a big con, because the only people who are really benefiting from people taking off their clothes are the people who are looking at the person taking off their clothes. Okay, the person taking off their clothes, maybe some do it for money, they might feel they're benefiting that way, but that's a very tiny minority. For the majority, for the average person who's walking around thinking that part of my being free is to walk around half undressed and this is me expressing myself, is actually, the person doesn't really realize that they've been brainwashed. It's been a big brainwashing program in the secularized world, and of course it's spread around the world as well. If you look at traditional ways of being feminine in other cultures, such as Japanese culture, traditional ways of being feminine, they were much more subtle, and did not involve stripping down and showing off everything in someone's face. But nowadays you see that because this message has got out globally, that to be desirable, to be free, you have to kind of show everything in everyone's face. This has actually inculcated some quite crude ways of expressing one's humanity. Quite kind of unsophisticated, reductionist ways of expressing what you are as a human being. And of course, unfortunately, a lot of women around the world, from non-Western cultures that have inculcated this way of thinking, don't really realize that, again, they've fallen for the con. I mean, the only person who's really going to be benefiting from you revealing yourself in that way is the person who's looking at you. In a sense, you're giving yourself away for free. So there is this idea of a freedom, which is actually a very kind of restricted definition of what it is to be free. Ironically, it's a restricted definition of what it is to be free. It's the Islamic way actually goes back to some real basics that have kind of gone missing, again, particularly in the secularized Western world. The basics of guarding your dignity, and to use a very unfashionable word, guarding your chastity as well. Now, this isn't just special to Islam. We see in all the paths and all the ways, with a capital W, whichever tradition you look at, the majority of them teach that you must guard this aspect of yourself. You don't exploit that aspect of yourself. You don't just give it away randomly to whoever. And that actually to not guard that aspect of yourself and engage with it in a conscious fashion, just leads to corruption. It just leads to, and I'm not just talking about moral corruption, it leads to mental and psychological and spiritual corruption as well. This is what most of the spiritual paths in the world teach. It's only in the last kind of 100 years, like I said, particularly in a very wealthy, secularized Western world, that the message has got out to have free relations with whoever. Doesn't matter, just have free relations with whoever. And that's called love. I mean, now we've got all these marches going on, talking about love and what's the problem with love. Well, the issue is it's not love. That's not love. Actually, what those marches are campaigning for is freedom to just get together with however many people you want to get together with at whatever time. No restriction, doesn't matter. And what that is not teaching the world's population is that the more that people engage unconsciously in promiscuity and in self-exploitation, contrarily, the harder the heart becomes. So that it becomes a mechanical process that people engage in. When you read stories of actual relationships that are going on in the world that outwardly were sold as being kind of quite free relationships, when you dig a little deeper, you see that there was actually a lot of abuse and exploitation going on. So even just recently I was looking at a video on a city that Osho Rajneesh set up in United States, and that was supposed to be a kind of an ideal city where everyone's blissed out, and and actually, and you can check this on YouTube, it's on YouTube, actually the reality was that because it was all kind of free for all, do whatever you want, sexually transmitted diseases were running rife throughout this so-called ideal city. And the parents were so busy kind of being blissed out and being free that the children were hugely neglected. They were just left to get on with it on their own. So these are the dangers of actually straying away from quite a disciplined path of how you utilize or how you engage with the physical aspect of yourself. So yes, Islam, it has very kind of classical, straightforward, plain regulations on how you conduct yourself outwardly, and that provides the container, that provides the means by which you can then focus on your self-worth as a human being, and from that self-worth comes self-knowledge. A lot of the lack of self-knowledge and confusion about who you are comes from having had your sense of self messed up by other people. So your sense of self gets messed up by other people who are messed up. And nowadays, it's very hard to find people who really do have proper knowledge and who really do have a proper wisdom and who can really offer some real guidance and insight. It's very difficult to find such a person that you can trust. Most of the time, people, they don't really know, they don't really have an idea, they're just kind of making their way in the dark or making it up as they go along. Now, particularly with the Western secular environment, when people borrow different aspects of different religions to engage in, when it comes to the aspect of morality, they still hold on to the undisciplined way of having relationships and way of exploiting their own sexuality that has been inculcated into Western societies for the last 100 years. So that aspect of ethics, the ethics of the self, the ethics of the conduct of the self is missing. And what I found was that actually you need to have an ethics of the self. You need to have some kind of moral framework. It sounds very boring. It doesn't sound very exciting nowadays, but that is going to protect you when you start to engage on your spiritual path. You need to get yourself set up with self-protection before you embark on your path, because you're going to have a lot of challenges coming your way, and you cannot afford to have a flaky sense of self when you are embarking on this path. So embarking on the path, first of all, requires discovering your own worth as a person, discovering your own worth as a human being, and conducting yourself in society from that place of self-worth. So this is the tip for today, and just want to thank you all for listening, and inshallah I will load up another video soon. Assalamu alaikum.